15 years passed, and the galaxy forgot about humanity. That was the thing about the Galactic Council and the elder races that filled its chambers. They measured time in centuries and civilizations in millennia. 15 years was nothing to them. A blink, a footnote. The Vorath Dominion filed the expulsion of Earth under minor administrative actions and moved on to conquering neutral systems along the galactic rim. The Keth Collective retreated into their hive stations and debated philosophy among their billions of linked minds. The Solari Communion continued their endless study of the universe's deeper mysteries. None of them looked toward the Valen Drift. None of them wondered what the humans were doing in that cold, empty corner of space. This was, by any measure, the worst mistake any of them had ever made. Dr. Nathan Cole had not slept more than 5 hours a night in 15 years, and he had no intention of starting now. Project Ironclad had grown from a single laboratory in a hollowed-out asteroid to a sprawling network of research stations, testing facilities, and manufacturing plants spread across the drift. The Viridium ore that Kevin Marsh's team had discovered in the early days of the exile had turned out to be something extraordinary. Its energy conduction properties were not just superior to existing technology, they existed in an entirely different category. Nathan and his team had spent 3 years understanding its molecular structure, 2 years learning to refine it, and the rest of the time building things with it that would have made the Council's best engineers weep. The crown jewel was the Viridium Arc Core, a reactor system that produced 3 times the energy output of standard Council fusion drives, while consuming half the fuel. It was smaller, more stable, and generated a unique energy signature that existing sensors could not detect at range. Nathan had presented the first working prototype to the compact leadership, in a quiet ceremony attended by exactly 12 people. President Laura Beckett, in the final year of her second term, had looked at the glowing reactor core and then at Nathan and said simply, "Build me a fleet." And so they had. 7 orbital shipyards had been constructed in hidden locations throughout the drift, masked by asteroid fields and sensor jamming stations that used Viridium-based technology the Council had never encountered. The yards operated around the clock, 3 shifts of workers who understood that what they were building was not just ships, but the future of their species. They called the largest yard Forge Station, and it was there that the first true warships of the Terran Navy took shape. Admiral Sam Delaney had been a captain in Earth's old diplomatic escort fleet, a handful of lightly armed vessels whose primary job had been to look presentable at Council functions. He was a tall, quiet man from Montana who had grown up on a cattle ranch and still carried himself with the unhurried patience of someone used to wide-open spaces. He spoke softly, never raised his voice, and had a way of looking at people that made them want to do their best work. The Compact had given him command of the new Navy, and he had spent a decade building it from nothing. His fleet doctrine was something entirely new. He had studied every naval tradition in human history, from ancient triremes to aircraft carriers to the first orbital defense platforms, and he had blended those lessons with everything humanity had learned about alien combat tactics during their decades in the Council. His ships were fast, heavily armed, and designed to fight in ways the Council had never seen. Where Vorath warships were built like battering rams, massive, heavily armored, meant to close distance and overwhelm, Delaney's ships were built like wolves. They hunted in coordinated packs, struck from unexpected angles, and used their superior speed to control the terms of every engagement. His second-in-command was Grace Whitfield, now a rear admiral with silver in her hair and steel in her spine. She had overseen the construction of every major vessel in the fleet, and knew their systems better than the engineers who built them. She was the one who had suggested naming the capital ships after virtues, rather than places or people, a tradition that stuck. The fleet's flagship was the Terran Valor, a dreadnought-class warship 2 kilometers long, armed with Viridium lance batteries that could deliver concentrated energy beams of devastating power over extraordinary range. Lieutenant Megan Holt arrived at Forge Station on a supply shuttle and fell in love with the place immediately. She was 28, a fighter pilot who had graduated at the top of her class at the Terran Naval Academy, an institution that had not existed 10 years earlier. She was brash, confident, and had reflexes that the flight surgeons described as statistically improbable. She was assigned to lead a strike squadron of the new Peregrine-class fighters, small and nimble craft built around a miniaturized Viridium core that gave them acceleration capabilities no Council fighter could match. While the Navy grew, Director Allison Grant was fighting a quieter war. She ran Terran intelligence from a nondescript office aboard a station that did not officially exist. Her network of operatives had spent years infiltrating Council space, using disguised freighters, forged trade permits, and contacts among the Fenari, the only species that had voted against humanity's expulsion. The Fenari were traitors by nature and culture, and their ships went everywhere. Allison had cultivated relationships with dozens of Fenari captains who were happy to carry Terran intelligence agents and equipment in exchange for access to human technology that was rapidly becoming the most advanced in the galaxy. It was through the Fenari that Allison learned about the Vorath Dominion's growing aggression. The Vorath had been annexing neutral systems along the galactic rim for years, absorbing smaller species into their domain through a combination of military threats and economic pressure. The Council debated and passed resolutions and did nothing of substance. A Fenari trade envoy named Pris, a short, quick-eyed amphibian, who had adopted that nickname because her formal name contained 17 syllables, met secretly with Allison on a remote station and laid out the situation plainly. The Vorath were getting bolder, and the Fenari, who had no army and survived on trade alone, were getting scared. Pris proposed a formal alliance. The Fenari would provide intelligence, trade networks, and diplomatic cover. In exchange, Earth would provide protection and access to Viridium-enhanced technology. Allison sent the proposal up the chain to President Andrew Nolan, who had succeeded Beckett 4 years earlier. Nolan approved it within a week. Then came the incident that changed everything. A Vorath scouting squadron, 3 fast cruisers on a routine patrol, wandered into the outer edge of the Valen Drift and detected an energy signature they did not recognize. They followed it to one of Earth's mining stations, a squat, ugly facility bolted to an asteroid. The Vorath captain opened a communication channel and ordered the station to surrender and prepare for inspection. His tone was bored. He expected compliance. Humans were a minor species with outdated technology, confined to a worthless stretch of space. This would be simple. The station commander, a weathered woman named Diane Pratt, listened to the Vorath demand and then closed the channel. She activated the station's defense grid, 4 concealed turret platforms powered by Viridium arc cores, hidden inside what looked like ordinary maintenance pods. The Vorath had no time to react. The turrets fired concentrated Viridium beams that cut through the lead cruiser's shields in a single pulse and split its hull open. The second cruiser lasted 11 seconds longer. The third, its captain screaming orders into a dead tactical network, managed to spin around and engage its faster-than-light drive. It escaped into the dark, trailing debris and terror. The entire engagement lasted less than 90 seconds. Admiral Delaney received the report within the hour. He stood in the command center of Forge Station and stared at the tactical display showing the positions of his 12 capital ships and 46 escort vessels. Grace Whitfield stood beside him, reading the same data. "They will come back," Delaney said quietly, "and not with 3 ships." Grace looked at him with an expression that was not quite a smile, but carried something fierce in it. "Good," she said. "Let them come." Delaney nodded slowly. He reached out and touched the display, expanding the map to show the full extent of human territory. The colonies, the shipyards, the mining stations, the sensor networks, the fighter bases. 15 years of work, 15 years of exile turned into preparation. The forge had done its job. The steel was ready. Now it was time to see if it could hold. The Vorath did not come back with 3 ships. They came back with 80. Warlord Kravas assembled the punitive fleet at a staging point just outside the Valen Drift. He was an old soldier with scars across his snout and a reputation for brutality that he considered well-earned. He had crushed rebellions on 4 worlds, burned pirate strongholds out of asteroid fields, and once held a planetary siege for 11 months until the population surrendered from starvation. He considered the mission against Earth to be an insult to his rank, a task better suited to a junior commander and a handful of frigates. But the loss of 2 cruisers at a mining station had embarrassed the Vorath High Command, and they wanted the response to be overwhelming. 32 heavy cruisers, 24 destroyers, 16 frigates, and 8 dreadnoughts, including Kravas's flagship, the Wrath of Vorath, a vessel whose name had been enough to make entire systems surrender without a shot being fired. The fleet carried enough firepower to slag a continent. Kravas expected the campaign to last 3 days. He told his officers to prepare for a brief exercise in discipline, not a war. Admiral Sam Delaney had been expecting them. Director Allison Grant's intelligence network had tracked the fleet's assembly in real time, using Fenari trading ships that passed through the staging area and transmitted coded bursts back to Terran intelligence. Delaney knew the composition, the commander, and the likely approach vector within hours of the fleet's departure. He chose his ground carefully. Hallows Gate was a narrow corridor of navigable space, squeezed between 2 massive asteroid fields. It was the most direct route from the Council border into the core of human territory in the Drift. Any fleet approaching at speed would naturally funnel through the gate, because the alternative, going around the asteroid fields, would add weeks to the journey and leave the fleet exposed to harassment along extended supply lines. Kravas, who valued directness and despised caution, would come straight through. Delaney was certain of it. He deployed his 12 capital ships in a staggered defensive formation across the mouth of the gate. The Terran Valor held the center, flanked by the Terran Grace and the Terran Resolve. The remaining 9 capital ships were arranged in 2 curved wings that could close like a jaw when the enemy committed to the engagement. 30 escort frigates were hidden among the asteroids on either side, powered down and silent, and behind them, tucked into the shadow of a dense cluster of rock and ice, Commander Megan Holt sat in the cockpit of her Peregrine fighter at the head of 60 strike craft, running through her checklist for the 4th time and trying to keep her hands from shaking. She was not afraid. She was excited. There was a difference, and she had stopped pretending otherwise a long time ago. The Vorath fleet entered sensor range at 1400 hours, Terran Standard Time. Delaney watched the contacts bloom across his tactical display, 80 red markers advancing in a broad wedge formation. Classic Vorath doctrine. They believed in mass and momentum, in closing the distance and battering the enemy into submission with concentrated firepower. It was a strategy that had worked against every species they had ever fought. Was not going to work today. Delaney opened a fleet-wide channel. His voice was calm and unhurried, the way it always was. All ships, this is the Admiral. You know your positions. You know your roles. Hold formation until my order. We do this together, and we do it right. He paused and then added, They came here thinking this would be easy. Show them what exile taught us. Kravas did not bother with communication. He did not demand surrender or issue warnings. He simply ordered his fleet to advance at full combat speed, weapons hot. The 80 ships surged forward into Hallows Gate, their engines burning bright against the dark. Delaney waited. He let them come deeper into the corridor, past the point where the asteroid fields narrowed the available space and limited their ability to maneuver. He watched the range counter tick down. 40,000 kilometers. 30. 20. All ships, he said, fire. The Terran Valor's main battery discharged first, a concentrated Viridium lance that crossed the distance between the two fleets in less than a second. It struck the Wrath of Vorath, dead center, punching through the flagship's layered shields as if they were made of paper, and tearing a molten furrow through the ship's dorsal hull from bow to stern. Secondary explosions rippled along the wound. The flagship's lights flickered, died, and then the entire forward section broke away and tumbled into the dark. Warlord Kravos died in the first 30 seconds of the battle he had expected to win in 3 days. The Vorath formation shuddered. Losing a flagship was bad. Losing a commander was worse. But losing both in the opening moment of an engagement was catastrophic. And the chain of command fragmented as captains across the fleet scrambled to determine who held authority. In that moment of confusion, Delaney struck again. Megan Holt's fighter wing launched from the asteroid cover like a swarm of silver needles. 60 Peregrine fighters, each one faster and more agile than anything the Vorath had ever fielded, tore into the flanks of the enemy formation. They targeted the escort destroyers first, smaller ships that were supposed to screen the heavy cruisers from exactly this kind of attack. The Peregrines were devastating at close range. Their miniaturized Viridium cannons could not kill a capital ship, but they could strip away shield emitters, shatter sensor arrays, and cripple engine pods with surgical precision. Megan led from the front, her fighter dancing between volleys of Vorath defensive fire with a grace that made her wingmates both grateful and slightly terrified. As the Vorath escorts scrambled to deal with the fighters, they pulled away from the main formation, exactly as Delaney had planned. The Terran capital ships advanced in unison, their Viridium lances firing in coordinated salvos that concentrated overwhelming force on individual targets. Where the Voraths spread their fire across the entire human line, the Terrans focused. One Vorath dreadnought at a time, one cruiser at a time. Each target was isolated, hammered from multiple angles, and destroyed before the fleet moved to the next. The hidden frigates emerged from the asteroids and struck the Vorath rear, cutting off any organized retreat through the gate. The Vorath fleet, pressed from 3 sides, and leaderless, began to break apart. Some fought with desperate courage. A group of 4 Vorath cruisers formed a tight defensive cluster and held their ground for nearly an hour, their shields glowing white-hot under continuous bombardment, before a coordinated strike from Megan's fighters disabled their shield generators, and the Terran Grace finished them with a broadside. Others tried to flee through the asteroid fields, only to be picked apart by the frigates lurking among the rocks. The battle lasted 4 hours, from the first shot to the last surrender signal. When it was over, 31 Vorath ships had been destroyed, and 19 more were disabled and drifting. The remaining 30 had fled into faster-than-light travel, scattering in every direction. Earth had lost 2 frigates and 1 capital ship, the Terran Resolve, which had taken a direct hit to its reactor housing and suffered a cascading breach. Her captain had ordered the crew to abandon ship and then held the bridge alone while the evacuation completed, keeping the crippled vessel's weapons firing until the last shuttle was clear. The Resolve broke apart 12 minutes later. Admiral Delaney ordered full search and rescue operations, not just for human survivors, but for every Vorath sailor drifting in the wreckage. Shuttles pulled Vorath wounded from shattered hulls and brought them aboard Terran medical ships, where human doctors treated their injuries without question or hesitation. It was a decision that some of his officers questioned privately. Delaney did not explain himself. He did not need to. He knew that the galaxy was watching, and that how you treat a beaten enemy says more about you than how you fight. The Fenari trade networks carried news of the battle across the galaxy within days. The story was almost too large to believe. A banished species, confined to a worthless corner of space, had just destroyed the largest Vorath military expedition in 20 years. And then they had pulled Vorath survivors from the wreckage and saved their lives. The Galactic Council called an emergency session. The Vorath demanded a combined fleet to crush Earth once and for all. But the chamber was not united. The Keth Collective, cautious as always, pointed out that the humans had shown restraint. The Solari Communion said nothing publicly, but sent a quiet, encrypted message through channels that Allison Grant's intelligence network intercepted and decoded within hours. The message was addressed to no one in particular. It simply read, "We are listening." Back on Earth, President Andrew Nolan addressed the Compact in a live broadcast. He read the names of every crew member lost aboard the Terran Resolve and the 2 frigates. He spoke about what their sacrifice meant. And then he said, "We did not ask for this fight. We were cast out, and we built something worth defending. Today we proved that no one will take it from us." Kevin Marsh watched the broadcast from the observation deck of his mining outpost. The same deck where he had stood 15 years ago, watching a Vorath patrol cruiser sweep past. He was 41 now, with lines around his eyes and silver at his temples. Outside the window, the sky was empty. No patrols, no council ships, just stars. In her office, Director Allison Grant read the Solari message for the 3rd time. Then she looked up at her deputy, a young intelligence analyst named Chris Langford, who had been standing quietly in the doorway. "The cracks are forming," she said. Chris nodded. "What do we do?" Allison set the message down and leaned back in her chair. Her eyes were sharp and calculating, the eyes of someone who had spent 15 years learning how to take a galaxy apart at the seams. "We drive the wedge," she said. "Wars are not won only with guns and ships." Allison Grant had said that in a briefing once, early in her career, and nobody had paid attention. They were paying attention now. In the months following the Battle of Hallows Gate, the Terran Compact shifted its focus. The military remained on high alert. Admiral Delaney was not foolish enough to assume the Vorath would stay quiet. But the real offensive moved into back rooms, neutral stations, and encrypted communication channels. If the first phase of humanity's exile had been about building a fleet, this phase was about building something harder to see and harder to destroy. It was about breaking the galaxy's old order apart and replacing it with something new. Patricia Dunn was the woman chosen to lead that effort. She was 53 years old, a career diplomat who had spent the years before the exile serving in minor postings on council stations where nobody important ever visited. She did not give rousing speeches or pound tables. What she did was listen. She listened with an intensity that made people feel like they were the only person in the room. And then she spoke with a precision that left no ambiguity about what she meant. President Nolan had appointed her as the Terran Compact's first formal ambassador, not to the Council, which no longer recognized humanity's existence, but to everyone else. Her first target was the Solari Communion. The Solari were an ancient species, older than the Council itself, older than most of the civilizations that sat in its chambers. They were tall, slender beings with skin that shifted color with their emotions, and they communicated through a combination of spoken language and low-level telepathy that gave their conversations a layered depth most species could not fully perceive. They had been the intellectual backbone of the Galactic Council for thousands of years, providing scientific expertise, philosophical guidance, and a calming influence on the more aggressive species. But that influence had been waning for centuries, eroded by the Vorath's growing military dominance and the Council's increasing inability to enforce its own resolutions. Patricia met the Solari speaker, their highest representative, aboard a neutral station in unclaimed space, far from any Council censors. The station was a decommissioned mining platform that the Fenari had quietly purchased and converted into a meeting place for conversations that could not happen in public. Patricia arrived with a small security detail and a single datapad. The Solari speaker arrived alone, which was either a sign of trust or supreme confidence. Probably both. The conversation lasted 9 hours. The Solari speaker probed Patricia's intentions with the delicate precision of a surgeon. Why had humanity built warships instead of seeking diplomatic re-entry to the Council? What were Earth's long-term ambitions? Did the Terran Compact intend to become another Vorath, a military power that imposed its will through force? Patricia answered every question with patience and honesty. She did not oversell or make promises she could not keep. And when the speaker pressed her on why the Solari should risk their standing by aligning with a banished species, Patricia leaned forward and delivered the argument that would later be quoted in history texts across 100 worlds. You have spent 10,000 years debating in the council chamber while the Vorath take what they want, she said. We spent 15 years in exile and built something that made them afraid. You are scholars and thinkers, and I respect that deeply. But I am asking you to look at the evidence and tell me, which approach has a future? The one that debates while worlds burn, or the one that acts? The Solari speaker was silent for a long time. The colors shifting across their skin moved through shades Patricia had never seen before. Deep blues and silvers, that the Fenari translator later told her indicated profound internal conflict. Then the speaker agreed. The Solari Communion signed a secret treaty of mutual defense and knowledge sharing with the Terran Compact. It was the first formal alliance humanity had secured outside the Fenari partnership, and it cracked the foundation of the Galactic Council in a way that no military victory could have achieved. The Keth Collective was a different challenge entirely. The Keth were an insectoid species whose civilization was built on consensus. Not the kind of consensus that came from debate and compromise, but the kind that emerged from billions of minds linked together in a vast neural network. Every decision they made was processed through the collective, weighed by every individual simultaneously, and resolved into a unified position. It made them cautious to the point of paralysis, and it meant that convincing them required reaching not one leader, but an entire species. Allison Grant chose an unlikely envoy for the task. Chris Langford, her young intelligence analyst. Chris was 29, quiet, methodical, and possessed a rare ability to explain complex ideas in simple, patient terms. Allison had noticed that the Keth responded poorly to charismatic speakers and emotional appeals. Their collective consciousness processed sincerity better than charm, and Chris had sincerity in abundance. Chris spent 3 weeks aboard a Keth hive station, a vast organic structure that pulsed with bioluminescent light and hummed with the constant low frequency of billions of minds thinking in unison. He answered their questions, thousands of them, transmitted directly into a communication interface that displayed them as scrolling text. The questions ranged from the deeply strategic to the strangely personal. They asked about human military capabilities, economic models, and diplomatic history. They also asked why humans kept pets, what dreaming felt like, and whether it was true that humans sometimes cried when they were happy. Chris answered every question with the same calm patience. On the 19th day, the Keth Collective rendered its decision. They would not sign a full alliance. That was too large a step for a species that measured decisions in geological time. But they agreed to a non-aggression pact and limited trade in non-military technology. For the Keth, this was practically a declaration of love. While the diplomats worked, the Vorath made the mistake that sealed their fate. Furious about their defeat at Hallows Gate, and increasingly suspicious that the Council was fracturing, The Vorath Dominion launched a series of punitive raids against neutral species near the Valen Drift. Their logic was straightforward: terrorize anyone who might consider siding with Earth, and demonstrate that the Vorath were still the dominant military force in the galaxy. They burned supply depots, seized cargo ships, and imposed blockades on 3 independent systems. Then they destroyed a Fenari trading convoy. The convoy was unarmed. It carried food supplies, medical equipment, and consumer goods destined for 6 different species. The Vorath intercepted it at a transit point, accused the Fenari of smuggling Terran technology, and opened fire without waiting for a response. 14 ships were destroyed. 712 Fenari civilians were killed, including children. The effect was the opposite of what the Vorath intended. Instead of fear, it produced outrage. 3 neutral species that had been quietly weighing their options immediately reached out to Patricia Dunn and requested Terran protection. The Fenari, who had been humanity's quiet allies for years, publicly denounced the Vorath at every trade hub in the galaxy and began openly carrying Terran weapons on their ships. Even the Keth Collective issued a rare public statement condemning the attack, the first time in living memory that the Keth had taken a position on a military matter. Admiral Delaney used the time wisely. The Terran Navy had grown to 36 capital ships and over 200 escorts. He established forward operating bases in unclaimed systems beyond the Drift, extending Terran reach into regions the Council had neglected for centuries. Grace Whitfield oversaw the construction of Bastion Station, a massive new shipyard hidden in the shadow of a gas giant, capable of building vessels twice the size of the Terran Valor. Commander Megan Holt, freshly promoted after her performance at Hallows Gate, was sent on a mission that required every ounce of her skill and nerve. Flying a captured Vorath scout ship that had been carefully modified to pass sensor inspections, she and a team of 4 intelligence operatives slipped deep into Vorath space. For 4 months, they mapped fleet positions, cataloged supply routes, identified shipyard locations, and recorded communication patterns. They survived 2 close inspections, 1 equipment failure that nearly stranded them in hostile territory, and a moment when a Vorath patrol came close enough to see the hull markings, and Megan had to bluff her way through a checkpoint using a Vorath dialect she had learned from audio recordings. They returned to Terran space with enough intelligence to fill a database and enough stories to fill a lifetime. The final act of Part 4 belonged to Patricia Dunn. Standing in her office aboard the diplomatic station, she composed a message addressed to the Galactic Council. It was not a request for readmission. It was not an apology. It was not a plea. It was a declaration. The Terran Compact does not seek your approval, it read. We offer partnership to those who desire it, and promise consequence to those who threaten us. The age of your Council's unchallenged authority is over. A new order is rising, and it was born in the exile you imposed upon us. She transmitted it on an open channel, unencrypted, so that every species with a receiver could hear it. Then she set down the transmitter and looked out the window at the stars. Across the galaxy, on the floor of the Grand Assembly Chamber on Aethera Prime, the message played to a room full of delegates who had spent decades believing they controlled the fate of every civilization in the galaxy. When the transmission ended, there was silence. A long, heavy silence that carried the weight of an era ending. The Vorath representative stood and demanded war. But when he looked around the chamber for support, the seats around him were emptier than they had been a year ago. And the faces that remained were uncertain. The wedge had been driven. The Vorath Dominion had ruled through fear for longer than most species could remember. Fear was their currency, their diplomacy, their religion. And when fear began to fail, they did the only thing they knew how to do. They reached for more of it. The armada they assembled was the largest military force in recorded galactic history. 312 warships, drawn from the Vorath's own fleet and the navies of a dozen vassal species, who had been given a simple choice: fight with us or be destroyed after. The fleet gathered at the Vorath home system, a sight so massive that orbital observers said the ships blotted out the stars like a curtain being drawn across the sky. The Vorath's supreme commander, a younger and more ruthless officer named Tharvok, declared it a holy crusade, a war to preserve galactic order and destroy the human threat once and for all. It was the largest hammer ever built, and it was aimed directly at Earth. But humanity was no longer standing alone in the dark. The alliance that Patricia Dunn and Allison Grant had spent years building came together with a speed that surprised even them. The Fenari committed their entire trading fleet, hundreds of fast, nimble ships that had been quietly retrofitted with Terran weapons and shield technology. They were not warships in any traditional sense, but they were perfect for harassment, supply runs, and rapid redeployment. The Solari Communion sent a flotilla of 40 advanced science vessels, each one carrying experimental systems designed to disrupt enemy communications, jam sensor networks, and weaken shield harmonics at range. The Solari were not fighters by nature, but they understood that this battle would determine whether the galaxy's future was shaped by reason or by force, and they had made their choice. The Keth Collective debated for 6 days. 6 days while the Vorath Armada moved closer. 6 days while Admiral Delaney planned and prepared and wondered whether his defensive line would be enough without the Keth's heavy cruisers. On the 7th day, the Keth announced their decision. The Vorath's destruction of a second neutral convoy, this time carrying Keth medical supplies, had tipped the balance. For the first time in their history, the Keth Collective committed military forces to an offensive action. 40 heavy cruisers, each one a mountain of organic armor and dense plating, moved out from Keth space and joined the Terran fleet. 11 other species, small nations and independent worlds that had suffered under Vorath intimidation for centuries, sent whatever they could spare. Some sent a single warship. One sent 3 armed transports that had been hastily converted from cargo haulers. It did not matter. Every ship that arrived carried with it a message that went beyond military calculation. It meant that the galaxy was choosing sides, and it was not choosing the Vorath. Admiral Sam Delaney commanded the combined fleet from the bridge of the Terran Sovereign, a super dreadnought that had been completed at Bastion Station just 4 months earlier. It was 3 kilometers long, bristling with next-generation Viridium weapons, and carried enough firepower to crack a moon. Grace Whitfield commanded the 2nd Battle Group from the bridge of the Terran Valor. Commander Megan Holt, whose intelligence from her mission behind Vorath lines had been used to plan every element of the coming battle, led the combined fighter and strike craft wings. Over 800 small ships drawn from Terran, Fenari, and Allied squadrons. Delaney chose the Pale Expanse as the battlefield. It was a vast region of open space between the Valen Drift and the Council's core territories. No asteroids, no nebulae, no obstacles, just empty space stretching in every direction. Some of his officers questioned the choice. At Hallows Gate, they had used the terrain to their advantage. Why fight in the open? Delaney's answer was simple. At Hallows Gate, we needed the terrain because we were outnumbered and untested. We are not untested anymore. And this time, I want them to see everything we have. I want them to see what they created when they threw us away. The 2 fleets met on a Tuesday by Earth's calendar, though that detail would only matter to human historians. The Vorath Armada dropped out of faster-than-light travel in a massive wave. 300 ships spreading across the expanse in an aggressive assault formation. Tharvok had arranged his forces in 3 tiers. The vassal fleets in front, as a screen, the main Vorath battle line behind them, and a reserve force of heavy dreadnoughts held back for the killing blow. But Delaney's formation was different. He had placed the Keth heavy cruisers at the center of his line, their dense armor forming an anchor that could absorb enormous punishment. The Terran capital ships were arranged in two flexible wings that could swing wide or close inward depending on how the battle developed. The Solari science vessels sat behind the main line, already beginning to broadcast disruption signals that would degrade Vorath communications and shield efficiency. And Megan Holt's 800 fighters were spread in a loose cloud ahead of the fleet, ready to strike. The battle began at range. The Terran Sovereign fired first, its main Viridian lance reaching across the vast distance and striking a Vorath dreadnought with enough force to collapse its forward shields in a single shot. The rest of the Terran capital ships followed, each one targeting a specific enemy vessel with coordinated precision. The Vorath returned fire with everything they had, and the pale expanse lit up with energy beams, missile trails, and the bright flashes of shields absorbing impacts. Then Delaney played his hand. The Solari ships activated their full disruption array, and the Vorath communication network went blind. Suddenly, Farvok could not coordinate his fleet. Individual captains could see the ships beside them, but could not receive orders from the flagship, or communicate with squadrons on the other side of the formation. The vassal species, who had been pressed into service through threats rather than loyalty, found themselves cut off and confused. Some continued fighting, others hesitated. A few began to drift backward. Megan Holt saw the confusion and did not wait for orders. She led her fighters in a screaming dive straight at the Vorath command ship, a massive dreadnought called the Iron Dominion. 800 fighters swarmed its escorts, overwhelming their point defense systems through sheer volume. Megan's own squadron targeted the command ship's engine array, delivering precise strikes that disabled 3 of its 4 main drives. The Iron Dominion slowed, lurched, and began to drift. Farvok was forced to transfer his flag to a secondary vessel, a process that took 11 minutes. In a battle of this scale, 11 minutes was an eternity. Delaney ordered a full fleet advance. The Terran wings swept forward, the Keth cruisers pushed through the center, and the Vorath formation buckled. The fighting was savage at close range. Vorath ships fought with the fury of a species that had never known defeat, and they took a toll. Terran ships were damaged, disabled, destroyed. The Fenari lost a dozen vessels in a single engagement when a Vorath destroyer group targeted their lighter ships. A Keth cruiser was split open by concentrated fire from 3 dreadnoughts. Its crew lost. But the tide was turning. One by one, the vassal species began to surrender. Their ships powered down weapons, broadcast surrender signals, and drifted out of the fight. The Vorath, increasingly isolated, fought on, but they were outmatched in technology, outmaneuvered in tactics, and for the first time in their long and violent history, they were outnumbered in allies willing to stand beside them. The battle lasted 11 hours. By the 12th hour, the Vorath fleet was broken. Farvok, wounded and commanding from a secondary bridge on a damaged cruiser, sent a transmission requesting terms. Delaney accepted the surrender with the same quiet dignity that defined everything he did. He ordered all Terran ships to cease fire, dispatched medical vessels to assist Vorath wounded, and transmitted a simple message to the defeated fleet. This war is over. Your wounded will be treated, your prisoners will be respected, and your dead will be honored. We did not seek this fight, but we will define how it ends. 1 month later, President Andrew Nolan stood before the largest assembly of alien species ever gathered in one place. It was held not on Aethera Prime, but aboard Baston Station, which had been opened to Allied delegates for the first time. Representatives from the Solari, the Keth, the Fenari, and dozens of other species filled the vast hangar bay that served as a temporary assembly hall. The stars were visible through the station's observation panels, and the lights of Allied ships could be seen drifting in formation outside. Nolan declared the founding of the Terran Imperium. He was careful with his words, because words mattered now more than ever. It was not an empire in the old sense. It was a confederation of equals, built on voluntary membership, open trade, mutual defense, and a single founding principle: that no species would ever again be cast out, diminished, or silenced for daring to grow. Patricia Dunn was named High Ambassador. The Solari speaker and the Fenari envoy Pris stood beside her as co-signatories of the founding charter. The Galactic Council, its authority shattered and its membership hollowed out, voted to dissolve itself 3 weeks later. Some species joined the Imperium, others retreated into isolation. The Vorath Dominion, humbled but not destroyed, eventually accepted observer status. A bitter concession, but they had run out of alternatives. And on a small observation deck in the Valen Drift, Kevin Marsh stood at the window one last time. He was in his 50s now, gray-haired and weathered by decades of hard work in the places nobody else wanted to go. But the view outside that window had changed beyond recognition. Where once there had been nothing but rock and silence and a single lonely outpost, there was now a thriving hub of commerce and life. Ships from a dozen species docked and departed. Lights glittered across structures that spread for kilometers in every direction. The drift, that worthless stretch of space the Council had given to humanity as a final insult, was now the beating heart of a new galactic order. A young engineer joined Kevin at the window. She looked out at the traffic and the lights and the endless motion of a civilization in bloom. "What was it like before?" she asked. "Before all of this?" Kevin smiled. It was a small, tired smile that carried the weight of 40 years. "It was quiet," he said. "Just us and the dark. They threw us out here because they thought this was nothing. They thought we were nothing." He paused and watched a Fenari trading ship glide past the window, its hull painted in bright colors and its cargo bays full of goods bound for worlds that had never traded with each other before humanity made it possible. "They were wrong," Kevin said. Somewhere across the galaxy, in a small ranch house in Montana, Admiral Sam Delaney sat on his porch and watched the sun set behind the mountains. He had retired the day after the founding ceremony, handing command of the Terran Navy to Grace Whitfield, who accepted it with a firm handshake and the faintest trace of tears. Megan Holt had been promoted to the youngest admiral in Terran history, and was already making Grace's life difficult with ambitious proposals for fleet expansion. Nathan Cole was working alongside Solari scientists, pushing the boundaries of physics in ways that made both species giddy with possibility. Allison Grant continued to run the intelligence network with quiet efficiency, and Chris Langford had become the permanent envoy to the Keth, where he was regarded with something the Keth collective consciousness described as deep and persistent fondness. Daniel Holloway, the diplomat who had stood alone in red light on the council floor 40 years ago, was invited to address the Imperium's first full assembly. He was old now. His hair was white and his steps were slow. But when he reached the podium and looked out at the gathered representatives of dozens of species, his voice was steady and clear. "They'd banished us because they were afraid of what we might become," he said. "They were right to be afraid. Not because we are cruel, not because we seek dominion over others, but because we are the species that looks at exile and sees opportunity. They gave us nothing, and from nothing we forged an imperium." He paused and let the silence hold. "Let that be our legacy. Not conquest, but creation. Not revenge, but resolve." The assembly rose. Every species, every delegate, every soldier and diplomat and engineer, they rose together. And across the galaxy, on every colony, on every ship, on the observation decks of 1,000 stations, humanity and its allies looked out at the stars. They were no longer exiles. They were home. The Grand Assembly Chamber on Aethira Prime was the largest enclosed space ever built by any known civilization. Its ceiling rose so high that clouds sometimes formed beneath it, drifting between the tiered balconies where delegates from 342 species sat in silence. Light filtered down from crystal panels that shifted color with every vote: blue for unity, gold for celebration, and red for judgment. Today, the light was red. Daniel Holloway stood at the center of the chamber floor, alone. He was a tall man with graying hair and steady hands, and he had spent 21 years as Earth's ambassador to the Galactic Council. He had learned their languages, studied their customs, memorized their histories. He had believed, truly believed, that patience and diplomacy would earn humanity a permanent seat among the stars. Now he stood in the red light and listened to them throw his world away. The Vorath representative spoke first. He was a massive reptilian figure, with bone-colored ridges along his skull and eyes like molten copper. His voice boomed through the chamber's translation systems and echoed off the walls. He called humanity a threat. He said their rapid advancement was unnatural and dangerous. He pointed to Earth's new fusion pulse engines, their expanding colonies, and their stubborn refusal to allow genetic compliance audits. He said that if the Council did not act now, they would regret it within a generation. Daniel waited for the Vorath to finish. Then he stepped forward and spoke. He reminded the Assembly that humanity had obeyed every rule, honored every treaty, and never once raised a weapon against a Council member. He spoke about Earth's contributions to medical research, to deep space mapping, to the famine relief effort on Keth Prime that human volunteers had organized when no other species would help. He spoke calmly and clearly, the way he had trained himself to speak in this chamber, without anger, without desperation, with nothing but reason and truth. It did not matter. The vote came swiftly. The Vorath Dominion voted to expel. The Keth Collective, despite everything humanity had done for them, voted to expel. The Solari Communion voted to expel. The Drayan Technocracy voted to expel. One by one, species that Daniel had shared meals with, exchanged gifts with, and called partners, raised their signals against Earth. Only the Fenari, a small amphibian trading species with no military power and little political influence, voted in humanity's favor. They did so quietly, almost apologetically, as if they knew it would change nothing. The final count was 339 to 3. Decree 7714 was passed. Earth and all human territories were stripped of Council membership, banned from all trade lanes, and forbidden from expanding beyond their current borders. Any violation would be met with the combined military force of the Council. Daniel Holloway stood still as the chamber emptied around him. A Fenari delegate paused beside him on the way out and touched his arm gently, a gesture of sympathy in their culture. Daniel nodded, but said nothing. He watched the last delegates leave, and then he stood alone in the red light, in the silence, in the ruins of everything he had worked for. He transmitted the decree to Earth that night. 3 days later, President Laura Beckett stood before the United Nations General Assembly in a closed emergency session. The hall was packed. Every seat was filled, and aides lined the walls 3 deep. The air was thick with tension. Laura Beckett was a former Air Force general with sharp features and a voice that could fill a stadium without a microphone. She had been president for 4 years, and in that time, she had dealt with border disputes, economic crises, and the constant friction of managing humanity's small footprint among the stars. But nothing had prepared her for this. She read Decree 7714 aloud, every word of it, including the clause that authorized military force against any human vessel found outside designated boundaries. The hall was absolutely silent. When she finished reading, she set the document down on the podium and looked out at the assembled leaders. "They have told us there is no place for us among the stars," she said. Her voice was steady and cold. "Then we will make our own place, and it will be greater than anything they have ever built." The room erupted, not in protest, not in despair. Within 72 hours, the nations of Earth began negotiations that would have been unthinkable a week earlier. Old rivalries were set aside. Old debts were forgiven. The United Terran Compact was born, a single governing body for all human worlds, all human territories, all human ambitions. It was not a merger of convenience. It was a fusion born of fury and wounded pride and a collective refusal to accept the judgment that had been handed down. The Compact's first act was the creation of Project Ironclad. Its mission was simple on paper and monumental in practice: reverse engineer every piece of alien technology humanity had ever touched, improve upon it, and build systems entirely new. Leading the project was Dr. Nathan Cole, a former MIT physicist who had spent the last decade studying Vorath shield harmonics at a research station in orbit around Mars. He was a quiet, intense man who slept 4 hours a night and filled notebooks with equations the way other people filled journals with thoughts. His deputy was Commander Grace Whitfield, a decorated naval officer who had served aboard Earth's small diplomatic escort fleet, and who understood, better than most, how outgunned humanity truly was. They set up their primary laboratory in a hollowed-out asteroid in the Valen Drift, the barren stretch of space the Council had grudgingly granted humanity years ago. It was cold, dark, and empty. The Council had given it to them because nobody else wanted it. That was about to become the greatest miscalculation in galactic history. 6 months into the project, a young mining engineer named Kevin Marsh stood on the observation deck of a tiny outpost at the edge of the drift. He was 26 years old, with calloused hands and dust in his hair, and he watched as a Council patrol cruiser swept past the station in a long, slow arc. It was a deliberate show of force, a reminder that humanity was being watched, that the walls of their cage were real. Kevin watched the cruiser until it disappeared into the dark. Then he turned and walked back inside, back to his work. Deep beneath the outpost, drilling rigs were pushing into rock that no alien species had ever thought to study. What they were pulling up was a dense silvery ore that the outpost geologist had tentatively named Viridium. Early tests suggested it had energy conduction properties that surpassed anything in the known galaxy. Nobody on the Council knew about it. Nobody on the Council cared what happened in the Valen Drift. It was a wasteland, a dumping ground, a place for exiles and forgotten things. But seeds grow best in soil that nobody is watching, and deep in the dark of the drift, buried in rock and silence and the quiet anger of a banished species, something was taking root. Something that would one day shake the foundations of every throne and council chamber in the galaxy. The exile had begun, and with it, without anyone yet realizing, so had the Empire.